Imagine this with me for a moment. You're standing at the edge of a vast frozen plain, where the only sound is the whisper of wind moving across snow that stretches endlessly before you. The temperature is dropping not gently, but aggressively, as the sun, already low on the horizon, begins its early descent toward another long, dark night. Your breath forms pale ghosts in the frigid air. Your fingers are going numb, despite the layers you've wrapped around them. And all around you, as far as your eyes can see, there is nothing but white silence. Now, multiply that feeling. Multiply it across an entire people. Multiply it across centuries of winters. Winters that lasted not for days or weeks, but for 4, 5, sometimes 6 months of continuous cold. Winters where the ground became hard as stone, where water froze solid, where snow piled higher than your head, and where finding even one meal felt like a miracle worthy of celebration. This is the story we're about to enter together. Not the story of survival, as we might imagine it, dramatic rescues or desperate hunts captured in a single moment of glory. No. This is something far more profound, far more intimate. This is the story of how entire nations of people developed an intricate, sophisticated system of food acquisition and preservation that allowed them not just to survive winter, but to thrive through it, to maintain their dignity, their culture, their joy, even when the world around them seemed designed to offer nothing but hardship. When Europeans first arrived on the North American continent, they brought with them their own assumptions about food, about winter, about survival. Many of them perished during their first winters, unprepared and bewildered by the intensity of cold and scarcity. They watched with confusion as native peoples around them continued to move with purpose, continued to gather food, continued to maintain their strength and their spirits. How, the newcomers wondered, how are these people not starving? How do they know where to find anything to eat in this frozen wasteland? The answer is both simple and extraordinarily complex. It lies not in any single technique, but in a vast web of knowledge accumulated over thousands of years, passed down through countless generations, refined through trial and error and careful observation of nature's patterns. It lies in understanding that winter is not a time of scarcity to be feared, but a season with its own unique abundance, if you only know where to look and how to listen. Think about what we in modern times have forgotten. We go to a grocery store where summer strawberries are available in January. We have frozen food, canned food, transportation systems that bring fresh produce from thousands of miles away. We don't plan our lives around seasons anymore. Winter is simply a time we expect to have everything available to us, just as in summer. But for Native Americans living across the vast expanse of North America, from the frozen Arctic wastes of Alaska and Canada, to the Great Plains where buffalo roamed, to the temperate forests of the Northeast and Southeast, to the arid Southwest with its seasonal rains, to the bountiful coasts of the Pacific Northwest, winter was not something you could ignore or overcome with outside resources. Winter was something you had to understand, anticipate, and partner with. Winter was something you prepared for across all the other seasons, with every action aimed towards surviving what was coming. And that preparation began not in autumn when the first frost arrived. It began in spring. It began the moment winter ended, even though it seemed impossibly far away. Because that's one of the foundational insights that Native peoples across North America had discovered through generations of lived experience. Winter is always coming. Winter is always part of your planning. When you have food in abundance, you must think of the scarcity to come. When you hunt successfully, you preserve what you don't eat. When you gather berries at their peak, you dry them. When salmon run in the rivers, you smoke entire tons of them. This mentality, this constant awareness that everything you do has implications for survival months down the line, is something we've largely lost. And losing it, we've lost a kind of wisdom that sustained human beings for millennia. Listen to those words again. Sustained human beings for millennia. We're not talking about a few generations figuring things out through trial and error. We're talking about thousands of years of accumulated knowledge, tens of thousands of years in many cases. The peoples of the Pacific Northwest had been smoking salmon, using the same basic techniques for so long that archaeologists have found evidence of it dating back over 1,000 years. The peoples of the Great Plains had developed their hunting and preservation methods through centuries of intimate knowledge of buffalo migration patterns, weather cycles, and seasonal change. The Southwestern peoples had learned to grow and store corn in ways that allowed them to maintain food security in one of the harshest climates on the continent. This is what we're stepping into. Not a quick survival story, but a deep historical understanding of how human beings learned to live in harmony with their environment, to anticipate seasonal changes, to preserve abundance for times of scarcity, and to maintain not just survival, but a sense of purpose, community, and meaning even during the darkest, coldest months of the year. As you listen to what comes next, allow yourself to imagine this. Allow yourself to feel what it might have been like to be part of a community that understood the land so intimately. A community where elders could predict the harshness of the coming winter by watching the thickness of an animal's fur or the patterns of birds migrating south. A community where every person had a role in preparing for winter, children helping to dry food, women smoking fish and meat, men hunting and trapping, elders maintaining and sharing knowledge. This is a journey back in time, but it's also a journey into a way of thinking about food, about seasons, about community, about preparation that might teach us something important, even now. Let us begin. Before we explore the specific methods and foods, we need to understand something fundamental. There was no single Native American approach to winter food acquisition. The continent was vast, stretching from the Arctic Circle in the north to subtropical regions in the south, from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific, encompassing deserts, mountains, forests, plains, and rivers. And in each of these regions, the peoples who lived there had developed distinct approaches to finding, preparing, and storing food for winter. Begin by imagining the far north. The Arctic and subarctic regions are places where winter doesn't arrive with a gradual chill. It comes with stunning force. For peoples like the Inuit and the Athabascan, people spread across northern Canada and Alaska, winter wasn't a season of 4 or 5 months. It was a season of 8, 9, sometimes 10 months. The darkness was profound, days where the sun barely rose above the horizon, nights that seemed to stretch for weeks. Temperatures could drop to 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. The snow fell so deep that it buried entire structures. In this environment, the traditional sources of food that other regions relied upon simply weren't available. There were no cultivated crops like corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters that fed peoples further south. There were no large herds of buffalo migrating in predictable patterns. Instead, the peoples of the Arctic and subarctic developed a food system based almost entirely on hunting and fishing. They hunted seals, walruses, and whales along the coasts. They trapped caribou and musk oxen inland. They fished in rivers and lakes using techniques refined over generations. Move south and imagine the Great Plains. Here, the winter was indeed harsh, with temperatures that could drop to 20, 30 below 0 in the worst storms. But this wasn't the permanent darkness of the Arctic. Here, the winters were intense but not impossibly long, typically lasting 4 or 5 months. And before winter came, the Great Plains were home to one of the most remarkable animal populations ever to exist on Earth, the buffalo or bison, in herds that numbered in the tens of millions. For peoples like the Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Blackfoot, and numerous other Plains nations, the buffalo wasn't just food, it was everything. The meat provided protein, the hides provided clothing and shelter, the bones became tools and weapons, the sinew became cordage. Every part of the animal was used. And the challenge of winter wasn't finding food in the absolute sense. If you had successfully hunted buffalo in the fall, you had meat. The challenge was preserving that meat, keeping it from spoiling in the months of cold, and using it wisely so you didn't run out before spring arrived. Now shift your perspective again and imagine the forests of the Northeast and Midwest. Here, peoples like the Haudenosaunee, often called the Iroquois, the Anishinaabe, the Ojibwe, and others lived in a landscape of dense forests, rivers, and lakes. Winters in these regions were cold, temperatures dropping to 0 or below were common, and snow could be deep. But the forest provided something the plains didn't: year-round food sources if you knew where to find them. Deer could be hunted. Fish could be caught through holes in the ice. Nuts from hardwood trees, acorns, hickory nuts, black walnuts, could be gathered in fall and stored for months. Plants and roots that remained edible even under the snow could be dug up by those who knew which ones wouldn't poison you. In the southeastern United States, the climate was milder, winters were shorter and less severe, but paradoxically, this could create a different kind of scarcity. The growing season was longer, and agriculture could play a larger role in the food system. Peoples like the Mississippian cultures and later the Creek, Cherokee, and Seminole nations grew corn, beans, and squash, crops that could be stored dried for months. But because the winter wasn't as harsh as in the north, there was also a temptation not to prepare, not to preserve, not to look ahead. Communities that grew complacent sometimes found themselves struggling when an unexpectedly harsh winter came along. In the Southwest, we enter an entirely different world. Here, in what is now Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Utah, the climate was arid. Winters were relatively mild, but the great challenge was water and growing season. The ancestral Puebloans and later peoples like the Hopi and Zuni developed remarkable techniques for dry farming. Coaxing crops from seemingly unforgiving terrain, they grew corn, beans, and squash, the same crops as their eastern neighbors. But they did it in an environment where a single drought could spell disaster. This meant that preserving food wasn't just for convenience, it was for survival. A bad year had to be followed by a reliance on stored food from previous good years. And finally, imagine the Pacific Coast, the Northwest to be specific. Here, the climate is temperate and relatively mild. Snow is rare in many areas. The Pacific Ocean provides abundance in the form of salmon. The forests provide deer, elk, and small game. The diversity of food sources is remarkable, and yet, each spring, the salmon runs would provide such spectacular abundance that it would almost seem wasteful if you simply ate what you caught and let the rest pass. This abundance, paradoxically, created an opportunity for the peoples of the Pacific Northwest to develop one of the most sophisticated and efficient food preservation techniques ever created: smoking. These are the major environmental zones, but there are countless other variations. High mountain valleys where peoples like the Ute and the Navajo, Diné, had to adapt to altitude and sudden weather changes. The Great Basin deserts where peoples like the Paiute and Shoshone had to track and gather scattered plant and animal resources with incredible efficiency. Coastal areas where peoples could rely on shellfish and fish, giving them resources that didn't migrate seasonally. Each of these environments require different strategies, different knowledge systems, different preservation techniques. This is crucial to understand. There was no universal Native American winter food strategy because there was no universal North American climate or environment. Instead, each people, each nation, each tribe had developed specific strategies perfectly adapted to their particular landscape, their particular climate, their particular resources. And within each nation there were often numerous communities, each with slight variations based on local conditions. What unified all of these different approaches, however, was a mindset. It was the understanding that winter was coming, that preparation was essential, that planning for scarcity was not paranoia, but wisdom. It was the recognition that abundance in one season had to be translated into security in another season, It was the knowledge that your survival depended not just on your individual skill and intelligence, but on your community's collective knowledge, preserved and passed down through generations. This wisdom manifested in specific techniques, in preservation methods and storage systems, and hunting strategies that we will explore in detail. But before we get to those techniques, we need to understand the fundamental calendar, the fundamental rhythm that govern Native American life across the continent. We need to understand how a year looked when it was organized around food acquisition, rather than abstract calendar months. To understand how Native Americans found and preserved food for winter, we must first understand that their lives were organized fundamentally differently from ours. We think of the year as divided into 4 equal seasons: spring, summer, fall, winter, each roughly 3 months long. But this is an abstraction. When you're living by food acquisition, your year doesn't divide so neatly. For most Native American peoples, the year was organized into as many as 6, 7, or even more seasons, each defined by the availability of specific foods and the activities necessary to take advantage of them. These seasons overlapped in different ways depending on the region, but the pattern was similar across the continent: preparation for abundance, exploitation of abundance, preservation of abundance, and finally, careful use of stored foods during scarcity. Let us trace through a year as experienced by a people of the Great Plains, let's say the Lakota or the Cheyenne. Imagine yourself part of the band. Winter is ending. The snow is beginning to melt, though hard crusts of ice remain on the ground, and the nights are still bitterly cold. The stored food from autumn and winter, the dried buffalo meat, the pemmican, the dried berries, is running low. Hunger is real. This is the hardest time, known in some traditions as the lean season or the moon of starvation. But signs of change are appearing. Waterfowl are returning from the south. You can see them passing overhead in great flocks, heading to nesting grounds in the north. Some young hunters go out to catch ducks and geese. It's not abundant, but it provides fresh meat at a time when the stored foods are growing scarce. Then spring truly arrives. The grass greens, the rivers run high with snowmelt. Fish are moving up the rivers to spawn. This is the time of the spring hunt. You might hunt deer that are thin after a long winter, their ribs showing, but they're available. You fish in the rushing waters. You gather emerging plants. Some peoples gathered wild onions, wild asparagus, other tender greens. After months of relying on stored foods, fresh foods are crucial for health. The vitamin C in fresh vegetation prevented scurvy. The protein from fish and game provided strength. This is a season of relative abundance, not richness, but enough. Early summer arrives, and this is a time of preparation. Berries are beginning to appear. Strawberries, service berries, early raspberries. But these are foraged selectively, not intensively preserved yet. Meanwhile, this is the season when the great communal hunts might begin. Young men go out to search for the buffalo herds. Scouts are sent ahead to locate them. When they're found, a hunt is organized. Dozens or even hundreds of animals might be killed in a coordinated drive, where hunters would carefully stalk a herd or drive them off a cliff, an incredibly sophisticated hunting technique that required detailed knowledge of animal behavior and the terrain. The meat is enormous, more than can be eaten fresh by the entire band. So it begins. The butchering, the cutting of meat into strips, the hanging of meat on frames to dry in the sun. Mid to late summer is the season of intense preservation. Every day is devoted to drying meat, smoking fish, preparing foods for storage. Children are given the responsibility of tending the meat and fish as they dry, keeping flies away, turning pieces so they dry evenly. Women work together, preparing hides, cleaning fish, salting and smoking meats. Men continue to hunt, bringing in more animals. These weeks of late summer are sometimes as demanding in their way as the hunts themselves. The work is steady, unrelenting, And yet, it's also a time of intense social activity. Stories are told, songs are sung, friendships are forged over the shared labor of preservation. Autumn arrives, and this is the season of the greatest abundance and the greatest urgency. Berries are at their peak: chokecherries, serviceberries, wild plums, cranberries. Nuts are falling from trees: acorns, hickory nuts, walnuts. The final hunts of the season happen now, with special urgency, as families want to ensure they have enough meat. This is when some peoples would hunt smaller animals intensively, hunting rabbits, trapping beavers, snaring birds. The autumn hunts were different from the spring hunts. They had a desperation to them, a sense that this was the last chance to gather what you would need. And then, as autumn deepens and the first frost arrives, as the temperature begins to drop and the days grow noticeably shorter, the focus shifts from gathering to storing. The dried meat is packed away. The berries are processed and prepared for storage. Nuts are cracked and dried. The great communal food caches are prepared. Winter camps are chosen, locations that offered some shelter from the worst winds, access to water even in deep winter, perhaps proximity to a river where fish could still be caught through holes in the ice. Winter arrives in full force. The snows come. The temperature drops. The community settles into what might be called hibernation. Not a true hibernation where you sleep all winter, but a settling in, a shift to less active survival. Hunting continues, but it's different now. Winter hunting relies on different techniques: tracking animals in the snow, setting traps, breaking ice to fish. The pace is slower. More time is spent in camp, in community gatherings, in the transmission of cultural knowledge through stories and ceremonies. This annual cycle, with its variations based on geography and resources, was the fundamental structure of Native American life. And each season required different skills, different food sources, different preservation techniques. Now, let's understand what was happening during this cycle in terms of food preservation. The key insight is that Native Americans were not simply eating food as it became available. They were constantly thinking about scarcity, constantly moving food from abundance to storage. When they killed a buffalo in the fall, they didn't simply eat the meat fresh. Yes, some would be eaten fresh. The immediate caloric needs of the community had to be met. But the majority would be processed into a form that could be stored. The same was true of berries. When service berries were at their peak in the late summer, they would be gathered in enormous quantities, but only some would be eaten fresh. The rest would be dried, pounded, and combined with other foods. This was the philosophy that made winter survival possible. Every single food that arrived in season was evaluated not just for its immediate value, but for its potential to be preserved and used months later. And this required knowledge of which foods could be dried, which needed to be smoked, which could be stored frozen in cache pits, which needed to be mixed with fat to prevent spoilage. Over the coming sections, we'll explore these preservation techniques in detail. But first, we need to understand the specific foods that were available and how they fit into this seasonal calendar, because the techniques only matter if you understand what they were preserving. The foundation of winter food security for most Native American communities was meat and protein. Unlike vegetables, which are seasonal and require preservation, meat from a large animal like a buffalo, elk, or moose could provide calories and protein that, if properly preserved, would last for months. In the Arctic and subarctic, the primary protein sources were seal, whale, walrus, and caribou. Seal was incredibly valuable because seal fat, blubber, was rich in calories and also provided oil for lamps. In a region where plants were almost impossible to grow, seal and whale provided the bulk of the food supply. A single seal might provide 50 pounds of usable meat and fat. A whale could provide tons. The challenge in these regions was not finding protein during the seasons when hunting was possible. The challenge was preserving enough during the abundant seasons to survive the scarcity seasons. When a seal was killed, the fat was carefully rendered and stored. The meat was dried or frozen naturally by the intense cold. In traditional Inuit practices, a cache of seal meat could be preserved for months if kept at the right temperature. And in the Arctic, that temperature was maintained naturally by the permafrost. On the Great Plains, the primary game animal was the buffalo. In a single hunt, a successful group might kill dozens of buffalo. The meat from a single large bull buffalo could weigh 2,000 pounds or more. This represented an enormous opportunity and also an enormous responsibility. All of that meat had to be processed quickly before it spoiled, especially if the hunt happened in warmer months. The processing of buffalo was a sophisticated operation. The fresh meat would be cut into strips, sometimes pounded flat, and hung on frames to dry in the sun. This drying process would take several days to a week, depending on the weather. As the meat dried, water content decreased dramatically, which prevented bacterial growth and spoilage. The resulting dried meat, jerky, could weigh only a fraction of the fresh meat, but retain most of the protein and calories. A buffalo that provided 2,000 pounds of fresh meat might yield 200 to 300 pounds of dried jerky. This preserved meat would then be packed carefully and stored for winter use. In the eastern woodlands, the primary game animals were deer, elk, and smaller animals like rabbits and beaver. Hunting was often individual or a small group, rather than communal. A hunter might spend days stalking a single deer or setting traps for smaller game. The meat from these animals, while less abundant than buffalo, was more consistently available throughout the seasons. Deer hunting was particularly important in winter, when desperate deer might come closer to human settlements searching for food. In the Pacific Northwest, while hunting provided important protein in the form of elk, deer, and occasionally bears, the dominant protein source during winter was fish, specifically salmon. During the salmon runs, which typically occurred in late summer and early fall, enormous quantities of salmon could be caught and preserved. Based on archaeological evidence, scholars believe native peoples of the Pacific Northwest were conducting intensive salmon harvest and preservation by at least 1000 BCE, though some evidence suggests human consumption of salmon may reach back even further. The most significant protein source available to almost all Native American groups, regardless of region, was probably actually fish. Whether in freshwater rivers and lakes or in the ocean, fish provided a renewable source of protein that could be caught and preserved for months. In regions with good fisheries, like the Pacific Northwest and the Great Plains near major rivers, fish preservation became one of the most important survival strategies. Now, let's understand how these proteins were prepared and preserved. The methods varied by region and resource, but they fell into several categories: drying, smoking, salting, where salt was available, freezing in cold regions, and processing into concentrated foods like pemmican. The drying of meat was straightforward in concept, but required significant skill in execution. The meat would be cut into strips, typically about half an inch thick and several inches long. Care was taken to remove fat, as fat can go rancid and spoil the meat. The strips would then be hung on racks or laid on flat rocks and exposed to sun and wind. In the hot, dry climates of the plains and Southwest, meat could dry completely in a few days. In more humid regions, it might take a week or longer. The dried meat, jerky, was hard and brittle. Nothing like the soft, tender jerky we know from modern stores. But it was shelf-stable. Packed carefully in dry conditions, jerky could last for months or even a year. The smoking of meat was used for both meat and fish, but particularly for fish. The basic process involved exposing meat or fish to smoke from smoldering wood, usually wood that would produce a heavy, steady smoke rather than a quick flame. The smoke had multiple benefits. It accelerated drying, it imparted antimicrobial compounds that prevented spoilage, and it added flavor that made the food more palatable after months of storage. This knowledge may have developed over many centuries of observation and experimentation. In the Pacific Northwest, salmon smoking was elevated to an art form. A salmon would be split, cleaned, and hung on racks inside a smokehouse. The fire would be kept low and steady, producing dense smoke rather than heat. Depending on the thickness of the fish and the conditions, smoking could take anywhere from a few hours to several days. Some peoples, particularly the Tlingit and other Alaskan groups, developed a cold smoking technique that dried the fish while imparting significant flavor. The result was dried salmon that could last for months and could be eaten as is or added to other foods. One of the most important protein preparations we need to discuss at length is pemmican. Pemmican was a concentrated, nutrient-dense food that was perhaps the most important preserved food for many North American peoples, particularly those who were mobile or faced particularly harsh conditions. The word itself comes from the Cree language, meaning manufactured grease. Pemmican was made through a process that seems simple but required careful execution. Lean meat, usually from large game animals like buffalo, elk, moose, or deer, was dried completely. Once dry, the meat was pounded into a fine powder, almost like flour. This pounded meat would then be mixed with rendered fat that had been melted and allowed to cool. Historical records suggest the ratio was approximately equal parts meat to fat by weight, though some variations existed. In some traditions, berries would be added to the mixture for flavor and for their preservative qualities. The result was a dense, compact food that had an extraordinary caloric density. The beauty of pemmican was threefold. First, it was incredibly calorie-dense and could sustain a person on a relatively small quantity. Second, it was shelf-stable. If made properly and stored in cool, dry conditions, pemmican could last for years. Third, it was portable. A trader or hunter could carry weeks' worth of food while carrying relatively little weight or bulk. For this reason, pemmican became the food of choice for long hunts, long journeys, and military campaigns. Both Native American and early European traders relied on pemmican for exactly these reasons. A variation of pemmican made specifically by the Lakota was called wasna. Wasna was made with buffalo meat and fat, but with a specific emphasis on using choke cherries. The choke cherries were dried and pounded into patties, then mixed with dried buffalo meat and buffalo fat. Historical accounts describe a particular technique that the Lakota believed imparted a special flavor, using a specific type of stone found in local rivers. Wasna represented not just a food, but a cultural practice, a way of using local resources in a way that had been refined over generations. Another protein-rich preparation was fish pemmican. In regions with plentiful fish, particularly the Pacific Northwest, smoked fish would be pounded, mixed with berries and fat, and prepared in a way similar to meat pemmican. This created a food that was rich in omega-3 fatty acids and other nutrients found in fish fat, making it not just calorie-dense, but nutritionally dense in a different way than meat pemmican. The preservation of these proteins was not a solitary activity. It was typically communal work, which meant it was social work. When a hunt was successful, the entire community would gather to process the meat. Women, often leading the work, would cut meat into strips. Children would be responsible for turning the meat as it dried, keeping flies away, watching for any signs of spoilage. Men would continue to hunt, or would prepare the tools and materials for storage. Elders would supervise and offer guidance. This communal work had multiple functions. Yes, it was practical. More hands made the work faster and more reliable. But it was also social. It strengthened community bonds. It ensured that knowledge was transmitted. Younger people learned the proper techniques by watching and doing. It ensured that the work was fair and equitable. Those who worked in the preparation shared in the results. In many cultures, the successful preservation of meat was itself a cause for ceremony and celebration. The completion of the meat drying for winter was often marked by feasts where some of the newly dried meat would be cooked and eaten in celebration. These feasts served both practical and ceremonial purposes. Practically, they allowed the community to verify that the preservation had been successful and that the meat was good. Ceremonially, they gave thanks to the animals and to the spiritual forces that had made the hunt successful. The spiritual relationship with the animals being hunted was deeply embedded in these preservation practices. A buffalo was not simply killed for its meat, it was honored. The Lakota had prayers and ceremonies performed before and after hunts. Some cultures would carefully preserve certain bones or hides, believing that showing respect to the animal's remains meant the animal's spirit would remain cooperative in future hunts. This might seem like superstition to modern observers, but it actually had practical benefits. It prevented waste and ensured that the entire animal was valued and used. While meat and fish provided the calories and protein that sustained Native Americans through winter, plant-based foods provided crucial vitamins, minerals, and carbohydrates. And the preservation of plant foods required different techniques than the preservation of meat. In the Northeast and Midwest, one of the most important plant foods was corn. Corn had been developed by pre-Columbian peoples in Mesoamerica and had spread north to become a staple crop for many northeastern and midwestern peoples. Unlike the game animals that had to be hunted, corn was cultivated, grown in fields, harvested, and stored. Corn could be stored in multiple ways. The simplest was to dry the cobs whole. You could leave the dried corn on the cob and store the cobs themselves. Other peoples would remove the kernels from the cob and store them in sealed containers. The Hopi of the Southwest became famous for their sophisticated techniques of corn storage. They had special sealed rooms where dried corn could be stored for years, protected from moisture, pests, and temperature fluctuations. Corn, when dried, could last for an extraordinarily long time. Archaeological evidence has shown that corn stored in proper conditions could remain edible for several years. This made it one of the most reliable stored foods in the winter diet. When the community needed food, corn could be cooked by boiling it in water to reconstitute some of the moisture, or it could be ground into flour and used in various dishes. In the Southwest, alongside corn, two other plants formed the crucial food triad known as the Three Sisters: beans and squash. These three plants grew together and had been domesticated together by pre-Columbian peoples. Beans, particularly, provided a protein source that was crucial in regions where hunting was less reliable. Like corn, beans could be dried and stored. Squash could be dried, with the seeds preserved for planting and also for eating, and with the dried flesh stored for later use. Moving east, in the woodlands and plains, wild rice became an important staple. Wild rice is actually not a cultivated grain, but a wild grass seed that grows in shallow water. In regions where it grew, particularly in the Great Lakes area, wild rice harvesting became a seasonal focus, particularly in late summer and early fall. The rice would be harvested, dried carefully, and stored in tightly sealed containers. A single family might harvest and preserve 50 or more pounds of wild rice, which, when cooked, would feed many people. Nuts were another crucial plant-based food for many peoples. In regions with hardwood forests, the Northeast, Southeast, and the Pacific Northwest, oaks, hickories, black walnuts, and other nut-bearing trees provided abundant food in the fall. The nuts had to be gathered, which was labor-intensive, particularly when considering the nut-by-nut collection. But once gathered, nuts were relatively easy to preserve. They could be dried in their shells and stored in cool, dry conditions for months. Some nuts, like acorns, were bitter and required processing, leaching with water to remove the tannins. But once processed, they could be ground into flour or stored as whole kernels. There is archaeological evidence that in some regions, nut storage was elaborate and careful. In the Pacific Northwest, peoples would carefully cache nuts in prepared storage pits, sometimes sealed with leaves or bark to protect from moisture and pests. A successful nut harvest could provide a family with food security for months. Berries represented a unique challenge in preservation because they are small, fragile, and prone to rapid spoilage. However, native peoples developed multiple techniques for preserving berries. The simplest was sun drying. Berries would be spread on flat rocks or mats and left to dry in the sun. As they dried, they would shrivel to a fraction of their fresh size, but retain their nutritional value and sweet flavor. Dried berries could be eaten directly as a snack, or they could be pounded into cakes and stored, or they could be mixed with dried meat and fat to make pemmican. Some berries were preserved through smoking or fermenting. In the Pacific Northwest and other regions with constant moisture, some peoples would smoke berries, which would dry them, while also protecting them from mold. In some cultures, particularly in northern regions, berries would be partially fermented, creating a sour, tangy flavor that was both palatable and preserved through the natural process of fermentation. Roots and tubers were also important plant foods. These were often dug from the ground in spring and fall and could be eaten fresh or dried. The beauty of roots and tubers was that they could sometimes be left in the ground through winter, where they were naturally preserved. In regions with permafrost or deeply frozen ground, a root crop left in the earth would remain frozen until spring, essentially providing a natural refrigerator. The storage of plant foods required specific environmental conditions that varied by food type. Dried corn and beans needed to be kept dry and protected from pests. Nuts needed protection from moisture and mold. Berries needed careful protection from insects. This is where the specialized storage systems came in: cache pits, root cellars, and sealed storage containers. A cache pit was typically a hole dug in the ground, often shaped like an upside-down bell or jug, wide at the bottom and narrower at the top. The pit would be lined with bark, animal hides, or grass to protect the contents from moisture and direct contact with the soil. Once the food was placed inside, the pit would be sealed with more bark, grass, or a wooden cover, often covered with earth to provide additional insulation and protection from animals. In proper conditions, a cache pit could preserve dried foods for many months, sometimes over a year. Archaeological evidence shows that cache pits were used across North America, from the eastern woodlands to the Great Plains to the Pacific Northwest. The Anishinaabe people of the Great Lakes region had sophisticated cache pit systems that were documented in historical records. The pits were sometimes marked with poles or other indicators so they could be located again in winter when snow covered the ground. A family might have multiple cache pits, each containing different foods, allowing them to organize their stores and ensure diversity in their diet. In colder regions, particularly the Arctic and subarctic, the natural freezing of food was used extensively. A cache of dried meat or fish could be frozen solid in permafrost and would remain preserved as long as it remained frozen. Some peoples would deliberately place foods in locations where they would freeze and remain frozen. In these regions, the challenge wasn't preservation. Freezing was highly effective, but rather keeping the food from being discovered and eaten by animals like bears or wolves. One of the most sophisticated food preservation systems was developed by the peoples of the Pacific Northwest, particularly the Tlingit, Haida, and other groups. In this region, the abundance wasn't in the form of cultivated crops or vast herds of game animals, but rather in the form of salmon. Salmon runs provided temporary abundance that could be transformed through smoking into a reliable winter food source. But beyond salmon, the peoples of the Pacific Northwest also relied on preserved plant foods. They developed techniques for preserving berries, particularly huckleberries, which they would gather in quantity during late summer and early fall. Some accounts describe smoking berries in house structures alongside fish, creating a kind of mixed food smokehouse. The berries would be dried and then compressed into cakes, which could be stored and eaten through winter. Now, we must turn our attention to the hunting and trapping techniques that Native Americans used to obtain meat during winter. Winter hunting presented unique challenges. animals were scarce, as many species migrated south or became less active in the cold. Snow made tracking easier, but also made stalking more difficult. The extreme cold meant that hunters had to be extraordinarily careful. Frostbite and hypothermia were real dangers. A hunter caught away from shelter during a sudden storm could die within hours. Yet, hunting during winter was also in some ways more productive than hunting in other seasons. Desperate animals came closer to human settlements. Trapped animals left clear tracks in the snow that could be followed for hours or even days. The snow itself was a weapon, allowing hunters to approach animals who were weakened by hunger and cold. In the Great Plains, winter hunting of buffalo was different from the fall hunts. The great herds had already moved south, or had been largely killed off by the successful fall and early winter hunts. Winter hunting was often for smaller groups of buffalo that remained in the region, as well as for elk and deer. Hunters would track animals in the snow, sometimes following a trail for a full day before getting a clear shot. The hunt might yield a single animal, but even one elk or several deer could provide enough meat to feed a family for weeks. The snowshoe was an invention of crucial importance for winter hunting in northern regions. Snowshoes are simple devices, frames that distribute the weight of a person across a larger surface area, so they don't sink deep into snow. The Anishinabek, Haudenosaunee, and other peoples of the north developed various designs of snowshoes, each adapted to particular snow conditions. Long, narrow snowshoes were used in forests where trees provided some shelter from wind and snow stayed light. Wider, rounder snowshoes were used in open areas where the snow was denser and deeper. With snowshoes, a hunter could move across snow that would otherwise be impassable, tracking deer or moose that were also struggling through the snow. The relative mobility advantage often went to the hunter, who could move faster than the exhausted prey animal. Moose hunting with snowshoes was particularly sophisticated. The hunter would track a moose in the snow for hours, exhausting the animal until the moose was so tired it could barely move. Then the final stalk and kill was relatively straightforward. Trapping was another crucial winter hunting strategy, particularly for smaller animals. Throughout North America, native peoples developed sophisticated trap systems. Deadfalls, arrangements of heavy logs or stones that would fall and kill an animal when triggered, were used for rabbits, squirrels, and larger game. Snares, nooses made from cordage, were used to catch birds and small mammals. Fish traps made from woven branches or stone could be placed in rivers and streams, allowing fish to enter but not exit. In the Arctic, sophisticated seal hunting techniques were developed. During winter, seals maintain breathing holes in the ice. Hunters would wait motionlessly beside a breathing hole for hours, sometimes an entire day, until a seal surfaced to breathe. Then, with a quick harpoon strike, the seal would be killed. This required extraordinary patience and an ability to withstand intense cold, but the reward was significant. A single seal might provide 50 pounds of food and precious fat. The preparation of hunting tools for winter was itself a significant undertaking. Bows and arrows had to be maintained and protected. The cold made bone and wood brittle, and careful storage was necessary to prevent weapons from becoming damaged. Arrow tips had to be checked and replaced as needed. For hunting in snow, some peoples developed specialized arrows with wider heads to prevent them from disappearing in deep snow. One of the most important winter hunting developments was the creation of community-based hunting strategies. Unlike fall hunts that were sometimes competitive, where families tried to get the best locations and kill the most animals, winter hunting often involved more cooperation. A successful hunter would share meat with those who were less successful. This ensured that everyone in the community had sufficient calories, even if individual hunters had varying degrees of luck. The concept of the hunt leader emerged in many cultures. This was an experienced hunter who would organize winter hunts, decide where to hunt, and coordinate the efforts of multiple hunters. The hunt leader didn't necessarily take the largest share of the kill, but they did have significant social status and were often compensated through gifts and respect. In some regions, particularly the Pacific Northwest and the Northeast, hunting large marine mammals like whales or seals involved elaborate community rituals and specialized equipment. A whale hunt might involve multiple canoes, specialized harpoons with detachable heads connected to buoys, and careful coordination among crews. These hunts were dangerous. A whale could destroy a canoe and kill hunters with a sweep of its tail. But the reward was enormous. A single whale could provide enough meat and fat for an entire community to survive for months. Ice fishing represents another category of winter hunting that deserves special attention. In regions with freezing lakes and rivers, fishing could continue through winter by cutting holes through the ice. The technique was simple but effective. A hole was chopped through the ice, usually with an ice chisel made from bone or antler. Then, a fishing line or net could be lowered through the hole. Some peoples had sophisticated line fishing techniques using hooks made from bone or stone. Others used nets that could trap multiple fish. In some regions, particularly among the peoples of the northern forests, there were traditional ice fishing grounds that had been used for generations. Families would visit these locations each winter, setting up temporary camps near the most productive fishing spots. The ice fishing could be productive enough to provide significant portions of the winter diet. The preservation of meat hunted during winter was different from preservation during other seasons. Winter cold provided natural freezing. Meat could be hung outside a winter camp and would freeze solid. In fact, in many traditions, frozen meat was preferred for certain purposes. Some peoples would freeze meat deliberately, and then, in spring, would thaw it and prepare it through smoking or drying, combining the benefits of winter freezing with longer-term preservation through heat drying. There is something worth noting about the spiritual relationship with hunting. Most Native American hunting traditions included prayers or ceremonies before a hunt. These weren't superstitious practices, but rather ethical frameworks. The prayer acknowledged the life that was being taken and asked for success and for the animal spirit to cooperate. Some traditions involve fasting before a hunt as a form of ritual purification. Others involve specific ceremonies that had been passed down through generations, each with particular words and gestures. In the harsh environment of winter hunting, these spiritual practices served important functions beyond the metaphysical. They reinforced cultural values around the respectful use of animals. They gave structure and meaning to dangerous activities. They helped prepare hunters mentally for the challenges ahead. A hunter who had performed the proper ceremonies felt a greater sense of connection to the task and to the community's expectations. Among all the preservation techniques developed by Native Americans, fish smoking and preservation deserves extended attention, particularly in the context of the Pacific Northwest, where it reached its highest level of development. Imagine yourself on the coast of what is now Oregon, Washington, or British Columbia in late summer. The salmon are running. Entire rivers become thick with fish, their bodies packed so densely that you can see them from shore, a rippling mass of silver and red. The sight is breathtaking, nature's abundance almost overwhelming in its intensity. For peoples living along the Pacific coast, particularly the Tlingit, Haida, Kwakwaka'wakw, and other Northwest Coast nations, these salmon runs were the foundation of their winter survival. The runs lasted from weeks to a few months, but they provided an opportunity to catch enormous quantities of fish, far more than could be eaten fresh. The challenge, as always, was preservation. The smoking process begins with the catch. A typical catch might involve weirs, barriers of stone or wood built into the river that would guide fish into traps. Or it might involve nets, which would be cast by skilled fishermen who understood the river's currents and the fish's behavior. Or it might involve hooks and lines, though for bulk quantities the nets and weirs were more efficient. Once caught, the salmon would be brought to the processing area. Here, the fish would be gutted and cleaned, often with remarkable speed. A skilled processor could clean a salmon in minutes. The fish would then be split, usually opened along the backbone, so that the two sides remain connected at the base of the spine, creating a kind of butterfly or butterfly-like shape that could be hung on smoking racks. The smoking structure itself was a sophisticated piece of technology. A smokehouse might be a permanent structure, or might be erected temporarily for the smoking season. The basic design involved a chamber where fish could be hung on racks or poles with an opening at the bottom for smoke to enter, and an opening at the top to allow excess smoke to escape. The fire would be maintained outside or in a separate chamber, kept low and steady to produce a heavy, consistent smoke rather than flames or extreme heat. The type of wood used for smoking was important. Some peoples preferred alder, which produced a mild, pleasant smoke. Others used various hardwoods. The wood would be placed on the fire so that it would smolder rather than burn brightly, creating the dense smoke that was essential for effective preservation. The smoking process could take hours or days, depending on the thickness of the fish and the desired final product. Some salmon was lightly smoked, dried enough for short-term storage of a few weeks. Other salmon was heavily smoked, which could extend its storage life to many months or even a year. The most heavily smoked salmon would be dark, almost black on the surface, and would have a pronounced smoky flavor. As the fish smoked and dried, water content decreased dramatically. A fresh salmon might weigh 20 to 30 pounds. After smoking and drying, the same fish might weigh only a few pounds, but it would retain most of the protein and fat, and it would be shelf-stable for months. One particularly sophisticated technique used in some Pacific Northwest cultures was the creation of layered storage. The smoked salmon would be packed carefully in cedar boxes or baskets, often with layers of leaves or herbs that would help preserve the fish and add flavor. These boxes would then be stored in cool, dry conditions, sometimes in specialized storage structures. The abundance of stored salmon allowed for the development of complex societies on the Pacific Northwest coast. Unlike the Great Plains, where the food supply was somewhat uncertain depending on buffalo hunting success, or the agricultural regions where crops could fail, the Pacific Northwest had a reliable, abundant, predictable resource. This allowed for the development of permanent or semi-permanent settlements, for the accumulation of wealth and property, for the creation of elaborate artistic traditions, and for the development of complex social hierarchies. Salmon wasn't the only fish preserved through smoking. Eulachon, also called candlefish, small fatty fish that were particularly abundant in certain regions, were smoked and their oil was rendered and used for cooking and lighting. Halibut and other larger fish were smoked and preserved. In freshwater regions, sturgeon and other large fish were caught and preserved through smoking. The efficiency and sophistication of fish smoking meant that in regions where salmon were abundant, the community could store enormous quantities of food with relatively little labor. A fishing season lasting a few months could provide food security for an entire year. This was one of the most significant food preservation achievements of Native American peoples. The social organization around fishing was also significant. Large-scale fishing operations required coordination and organization. A weir had to be built and maintained. Fishing sites had to be claimed and defended. The timing of the fishing had to be coordinated with the smoking and preservation process. In many cultures, fishing was governed by complex systems of rights and responsibilities. In some traditions, particularly among the Tlingit, the ownership of especially productive fishing locations was a mark of status and wealth. A chief or family that controlled a particularly good fishing site had significant advantage and could accumulate more preserved food than others. This surplus could then be used to hold potlatches, enormous feast ceremonies where wealth was distributed and displayed. The ability to provide salmon to one's guests was one of the highest marks of status. Beyond the Pacific coast, ice fishing in freshwater regions also led to preservation practices. In the Great Lakes and other large freshwater bodies, Whitefish and other species would be caught during winter and dried or smoked for preservation. The volume wasn't as dramatic as the Pacific salmon runs, but it was still significant. In fact, the Anishinaabe people of the Great Lakes region developed a particular method of whitefish preservation that involved smoking the fish whole, or in pieces, and then storing them in sealed containers. Historical records describe winter camps where dozens of families would gather at productive fishing locations, all engaged in catching and processing fish for winter storage. In regions where winter brought prolonged cold and deep snow, nature itself provided a freezing system that was utterly reliable. This natural freezing was used deliberately and strategically by native peoples across the northern regions of North America. The Arctic and subarctic peoples developed sophisticated understanding of how to use natural cold for food preservation. A food cache, dried meat, fish, or berries could be placed in a location where it would remain frozen throughout the winter months. As long as the temperature stayed below freezing, the food would not spoil, but simply placing food in the snow wasn't adequate. It had to be protected from predators. Wolverines, bears, wolves, and other carnivores were attracted to food caches and would dig into them given the opportunity. So, caches had to be elevated, placed on platforms or in trees, out of reach of ground-based predators. The development of cache poles or cache stages was an important technology. A vertical pole would be driven into the ground, and a platform would be built at the top, 8, 10, sometimes 15 feet in the air. Food bundles wrapped carefully in hides or bark would be placed on this platform. An animal would have to jump or climb to reach the cache, which was difficult enough that most animals would move on to easier food sources. Some peoples developed even more sophisticated systems. The Athabascan peoples of interior Alaska developed cache structures that involved multiple platforms at different heights, with only specific entry points, making them difficult for animals to access even if they could reach the first platform. In regions where the cold was reliable, but perhaps not quite as intense as the high Arctic, underground cache pits were used, particularly for foods that needed to remain dry. A pit would be dug below the frost line, deep enough that even in the coldest winter, the ground temperature would hover near freezing but not fluctuate wildly. Lined with bark or hide, such a pit could preserve dried foods for months or even longer. The genius of these systems was that they required no active maintenance. Once the food was cached and sealed, you could leave it for months, knowing that the temperature would remain constant and that pests would have difficulty accessing it. In the Northeast and Midwest, particularly in regions around the Great Lakes, a different system was used during winter. Ice cellars could be created by cutting blocks of ice from frozen lakes, storing them in insulated pits or structures, covering them with sawdust or straw to provide insulation. These ice cellars could maintain near freezing temperatures for months, even into summer. Foods like fish, meat, and even fresh vegetables could be preserved in these ice cellars. One particularly interesting preservation method involved deliberate freezing and thawing cycles. In some traditions, meat would be left outside during winter freeze-thaw cycles. The repeated freezing and thawing would actually accelerate drying in ways that were different from sun drying. A meat that went through this process might have a different texture and flavor profile, but would be shelf-stable and ready for spring and summer use. The challenge with natural freezing preservation was predicting when you could rely on it and when you couldn't. An unusually warm winter could spoil food stored outside. Migration patterns could mean that a region that was normally cold enough didn't reach freezing temperatures. This is why other preservation methods, smoking, drying, salting, where available, were always used in conjunction with natural freezing rather than as primary methods. In the Pacific Northwest, where freezing wasn't reliable year-round but where winters did bring periods of cold, food storage involved combinations of methods. Smoked salmon might be stored in cooler weather and cold storage areas, then moved to warmer areas for final preservation in spring. This combination approach maximized the benefits of each method while minimizing the weaknesses of any single method. There is an often overlooked dimension to Native American winter survival that involves fasting and spiritual preparation. While we've focused on the physical acquisition and preservation of food, the psychological and spiritual preparation for winter was equally important. Many Native American traditions included periods of fasting that were understood to have multiple purposes. Some fasting was directly spiritual, periods of reduced food intake or abstinence from specific foods during spiritual ceremonies or vision quests. Some fasting was preparatory, deliberately eating less in late fall to prepare the body for the scarcity to come. Some fasting was simply practical, on hunting trips or during dangerous travel. Food might be scarce, so the ability to function effectively on minimal food was valuable. A young person undergoing a vision quest, a spiritual practice in many cultures, might fast for days while seeking spiritual guidance. This fasting wasn't a casual deprivation, it was a deliberate test of will and body. When the faster began eating again after the vision quest, the food would taste exquisitely intense. A single berry or piece of dried meat would seem extraordinarily flavorful and satisfying. This sensory intensity served a purpose. It reinforced the preciousness of food. A young person who had fasted came away with an understanding at a bone-deep level that food was not a luxury, but a gift. This understanding shaped their entire relationship with food preservation and consumption for the rest of their life. Some older traditions describe deliberate conditioning of the body for winter through progressive reduction in food intake during late fall. An elder might train younger people to eat less as the season turned cold, thereby reducing the community's food consumption just as stored food quantities were being drawn down. There's also spiritual dimensions to understanding scarcity itself. Several traditions describe winter as a time of hardship and trial that was not to be avoided, but rather endured and transformed. The hardship of winter had meaning. It tested character. It strengthened community bonds. It created opportunities for spiritual growth and understanding. In some traditions, fasting during winter was a spiritual practice. A person might choose to fast on particular days, not to starve, but to deliberately reduce consumption as an act of spiritual discipline or gratitude. This might be practiced communally, with an entire community reducing food intake on certain days, as a way of honoring the ancestors or giving thanks to the spirits. The relationship between fasting and abundance is also worth considering. A people that experienced real scarcity understood abundance in a different way than a people that had never experienced want. When spring came and fresh foods began to appear, when the first berries ripened or the first young plants emerged, these foods were celebrated with intensity. Spring feasts were major events, with communities gathering to share the first fresh foods after months of stored food. This alternation between scarcity and abundance, between fasting and feasting, created a particular rhythm to life and consciousness. It wasn't a rhythm that modern people in societies of constant food availability experience, but it was a rhythm that had been part of human experience for most of history, and that still shapes the consciousness of many indigenous peoples. Some anthropologists have noted that in cultures with traditional feast-famine cycles, there is often greater psychological resilience around food than in cultures with constant abundance. A person who has experienced real hunger understands how to ration and preserve in ways that someone who has never experienced want simply cannot. The spiritual preparation for winter also involves ceremony and ritual. Many peoples had winter ceremonies, celebrations that marked the arrival of winter or that sought spiritual protection and provision during the difficult months to come. These ceremonies reinforced cultural values, strengthened community bonds, and created a sense of shared purpose and meaning around the struggle to survive. In some traditions, the first successful winter hunt was cause for significant celebration and ceremony. The kill would be offered spiritually to the ancestors or to the spirits. Gratitude would be expressed, the successful hunter might be honored with gifts or recognition. All of these practices reinforce the understanding that winter survival was not purely a matter of individual skill, but also a matter of spiritual partnership. Now let us move through specific regions and examine how different peoples adapted their food acquisition and preservation practices to their particular environments. The Southwestern peoples, the Hopi and ancestral Puebloans. In the arid landscape of the Southwest, where summers brought intense heat and winters brought cold but little snow, the challenge of winter food security was different than in northern regions. The Hopi, Zuni, and other Pueblo peoples, along with the ancestral Puebloans who preceded them, developed agricultural systems that made stored food central to survival. These peoples grew corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters, using dry farming techniques adapted to an arid environment. The harvest, when it came, had to sustain the people through an entire year until the next harvest. This put enormous pressure on the necessity of storage and preservation. Corn storage in the Southwest reached sophisticated levels. The Hopi developed special sealed rooms within their Pueblo structures, where corn could be stored safely from moisture, pests, and temperature fluctuations. Archaeological evidence suggests that the ancestral Puebloans built specialized storage structures called granaries. Special buildings or rooms designed specifically for food storage, dating to at least 1,000 years ago and likely much earlier. These structures were carefully built with particular attention to ventilation and pest prevention. Evidence from archaeological sites shows that these granaries sometimes held hundreds or even thousands of pounds of stored corn, enough to sustain a community for a year or even to provide surplus that could be traded. Beans were dried and stored similarly. Squash was dried and the seeds were carefully preserved. In addition to cultivated foods, wild plants and animals were used. Piñon nuts were gathered in fall and stored. Deer and small game were hunted, and the meat was dried and preserved. The risk in the Southwest was not so much immediate starvation during any single winter, but rather the danger of multi-year droughts. A year with poor rainfall might result in a poor harvest, which meant drawing down stored reserves. If the next year was also dry, stored food might be depleted before the next harvest. Communities that had carefully stored food from good years might survive the drought. Communities that had consumed all their stores might face starvation. Oral traditions describe famines that lasted years when multiple dry seasons came in succession. The Great Plains peoples, the Lakota and Cheyenne. For the peoples of the Great Plains, winter survival was intimately tied to buffalo hunting. The annual buffalo hunt cycle was organized around preparation for winter. In late summer and fall, coordinated hunts would bring down large numbers of buffalo. The meat was immediately processed into pemmican, jerky, and other preserved forms. A successful fall hunt might result in dozens of buffalo being killed. The meat from a single buffalo, perhaps 2,000 pounds or more, would be processed by the entire band. The hide would be scraped and treated to become leather or rawhide. The bones would be broken for marrow and then crafted into tools. Even the hooves and horns had uses. They could be made into containers or decorative items. The dried meat and pemmican would be packed carefully. Some was stored in rawhide containers called parfleches. Others was wrapped in rawhide or hides and placed in cache pits or elevated caches. The Lakota and Cheyenne sometimes built winter camps with underground storage chambers specifically designed for holding meat caches through the winter. Winter hunting would continue, but it was more of a supplementary activity. A hunter might track deer or elk through the snow, providing fresh meat to supplement the stored supplies. Ice fishing might provide additional protein, but the bulk of the winter diet came from the stored meat and pemmican from the fall hunts. The success of the spring and fall hunts was crucial. A poor hunt year could mean hardship or even starvation. Some historical accounts describe winters where buffalo were scarce. forcing the people to rely on smaller game or to move frequently looking for food. The strongest and most resilient communities were those that had successfully hunted in the fall and had adequate stored supplies. The Northwestern Pacific Coast peoples, the Tlingit, and Kwakwaka'wakwa. We have already discussed salmon preservation, but the broader food strategies of the Pacific Northwest deserve attention. The Tlingit, Haida, Kwakwaka'wakw, and other Northwest Coast peoples had access to multiple abundant food sources and developed what might be called a resource-rich winter strategy. The primary resource was salmon during the summer run, which was processed into smoked salmon for storage. But the region provided other resources as well. Halibut and other ocean fish could be caught and preserved. Herring and herring eggs were harvested. Deer and elk were hunted in the forests. Seals and sea lions could be hunted along the coasts. This diversity of resources meant that if one resource failed, others could be relied upon. If salmon runs were poor one year, the community could rely more heavily on stored fish from other species, or on smoked meat from hunting, or on preserved sea mammal fat. The combination of resources created resilience. The abundance of the Pacific Northwest also allowed for a different kind of social organization. The reliable food surplus allowed for the development of complex societies with artists, craftspeople, and specialists, rather than everyone being focused on food acquisition. The wealth from food preservation could be accumulated and displayed through ceremonies like the potlatch. The northeastern woodlands peoples, the Haudenosaunee and Anishinabek. The peoples of the Northeast developed a more diverse diet than the Plains peoples, but faced particular challenges from the transition between seasons and from the intensity of winter cold. The cornerstone of the Haudenosaunee diet was the agricultural complex: corn, beans, and squash. But these were supplemented by hunting, fishing, and gathering. Deer were hunted throughout the year, with particular intensity in fall and early winter. Fish were caught year-round, with ice fishing being particularly important in winter. Wild rice was harvested in fall and stored. Nuts, berries, and roots were gathered seasonally. The storage system was likewise diverse. Corn was dried and stored in sealed structures. Meat was smoked and dried. Fish were smoked or salted. Berries were dried or made into pemmican. Nuts were stored in their shells. This diversity meant that the winter diet had variety, and that different communities could rely on different primary foods depending on their local resources. The Anishinabek people developed sophisticated systems for managing their territories to ensure consistent food availability. Particular areas were designated for hunting, fishing, gathering, and agriculture. These territories were carefully managed. Controlled burns were used to maintain open areas for berry production. Water levels were managed to ensure good fish and rice habitats. Hunting was carefully regulated to prevent overhunting. The Arctic peoples, the Inuit, and Athabascan. In the Arctic, where nothing could be grown and where the plant resources were extremely limited, hunting and fishing were essentially the only food sources. The strategies developed were highly refined and specific to the Arctic environment. Seal hunting in winter involved waiting for hours beside breathing holes. Whale hunting involved coordination of multiple boats and specialized harpoons. Fishing for Arctic char and other fish was done through holes in the ice. The preservation methods were straightforward. The extreme cold meant that food simply froze naturally. Meat and fish cached in frozen earth would remain edible for many months or even years. The Arctic peoples also developed understanding of seasonal variations in different animals. Caribou migrations were tracked and hunted during specific seasons. Fish were caught during specific seasons when they congregated. This deep knowledge of animal behavior and seasonal patterns meant that hunting could be timed to maximize returns. One particularly important winter food in Arctic regions was blubber, the fat from seals, whales, and other marine mammals. Fat was incredibly important calorically and also provided oil for lamps. A seal's blubber layer could be several inches thick. Rendered seal fat could be stored in bags made from animal intestines and would remain edible for months or even years. Winter survival wasn't just about food, it was also about community organization and shelter. The way communities organized themselves for winter had significant implications for food security. In many traditions, winter was a time of gathering. Dispersed groups that might travel separately during other seasons would come together for winter camps. These camps were chosen carefully, based on factors like proximity to resources, protection from wind, and access to water. A good winter camp location might be reused year after year, even generation after generation. In the Great Plains, winter camps were often established in river valleys where cottonwoods and other trees provided some shelter, and where buffalo bones left over from processing could be used as fuel. The camps would be organized with structures arranged in patterns that provided protection and facilitated community activities. In the Northeast, winter camps were established near good fishing locations or hunting territories. The Haudenosaunee established winter villages where they would remain for months. In these villages, large communal structures called longhouses provided shelter for multiple families. The communal structure facilitated food sharing and collective decision-making. The winter camp was where the serious work of preservation and storage happened. Meat had to be dried, smoked, or processed into pemmican. This work was done in the winter camp. Berries were dried, nuts were cracked and processed. Fish was smoked. All of this happened in the context of winter camp life, where people lived in close proximity to each other. The winter camp was also where stories were told, ceremonies were performed, and cultural knowledge was transmitted. The long winter nights were perfect for storytelling. Elders would teach younger people about the world, the stories of creation, the histories of the people, the practical knowledge needed to survive and thrive. Councils and decision-making often happened during winter camp. The community would gather and discuss matters of importance. Leaders would be chosen or confirmed. Plans for the coming year would be made. Winter camp was the time for intense community interaction. The organization of food storage and distribution within the winter camp was important. In some traditions, each family maintained its own food cache and was responsible for its own consumption. In others, food was more communally managed, with a central authority deciding how much each family would receive. Most communities operated somewhere on a spectrum between these two approaches. In times of severe scarcity, the question of food distribution became critically important. If food ran out before spring, the survival of the entire community was at stake. In most traditions, there were protocols for responding to scarcity. A successful hunter would share with less successful hunters. A family with abundant stores would share with families with less. Elders and children had priority access to food. The community would reduce consumption collectively if necessary. The stress of winter could also bring conflict. Tensions that had been manageable in times of plenty could become acute in times of scarcity. Some historical accounts describe communities splitting up in winter when food was scarce, with some groups leaving to try to find better conditions elsewhere. Other accounts describe strict rationing and collective discipline to ensure that scarce resources were managed fairly. The role of women in winter camp food management was particularly significant. In many traditions, women controlled the storage areas and managed the distribution of stored foods. This gave women considerable power and status. A woman who was particularly skilled at preserving and rationing food might gain significant recognition and influence in her community. Section 12. Knowledge transmission and seasonal wisdom. Minutes 295, 325, 2,500 words. One of the most important aspects of Native American winter survival was the transmission of knowledge across generations. The techniques of food preservation, the identification of edible plants, the understanding of animal behavior, the predictions about weather patterns, all of this had to be learned and had to be carefully preserved as knowledge. In most traditions, much of this knowledge was transmitted orally. An elder would teach a young person about edible plants, and the young person would learn to recognize them by sight and touch. A hunter would teach hunting techniques through practice and demonstration, rather than through written instruction. A woman would teach preservation techniques by involving young people in the actual work of preserving food. This oral transmission meant that knowledge was preserved in stories. A story about a particularly harsh winter might also serve as a teaching story, explaining what went wrong and what could be done differently. A legend about an animal might encode information about that animal's behavior and seasonal patterns. Seasonal markers were important guides to timing. When the geese fly north, it's time to fish. When the berries are at their peak, the bear is hungry and should be hunted carefully. When the first snow falls, it's time to move to winter camp. These sayings, passed down through generations, encoded the accumulated knowledge of generations of observation. Observation of animal behavior was a sophisticated science. Different peoples had systems for understanding what particular animal signs meant. The thickness of an animal's fur could indicate how harsh the coming winter would be. The abundance of acorns could indicate whether bears would be particularly aggressive that fall. The early or late arrival of migratory birds could indicate whether to expect an early or late winter. This knowledge was so important that sometimes specialists emerged, people who were particularly skilled in certain areas and became resources for the community. A person might be known as particularly skilled at identifying plants, or at predicting weather, or at preserving meat. These specialists would be consulted, and their knowledge would be valued. The transmission of knowledge also involved testing and proving. A young person learning to hunt might go on practice hunts before being considered ready for serious hunting. A young woman learning to preserve food would work under supervision before being given responsibility for her family's stores. This gradual transfer of responsibility ensured that knowledge was properly learned before it was relied upon. Some traditions formalize the transmission of knowledge through initiation ceremonies or other rituals. A young person might undergo a vision quest and return with spiritual understanding that complemented the practical knowledge they had been learning. These ceremonies mark the transition from learner to responsible adult. The stakes of failed knowledge transmission were high. If important techniques were forgotten, if critical knowledge about seasonal timing was lost, communities could suffer or perish. This meant that knowledge preservation was taken very seriously. Important information might be repeated many times. Stories were told and retold. Practices were performed the same way year after year, ensuring consistency. In some cases, physical objects served as mnemonic devices, objects that helped people remember important information. A carved staff might have marks indicating different seasons or different foods. A piece of decorated clothing might represent particular stories or teachings. We have painted a picture of sophisticated systems and reliable survival strategies, but the reality was that despite all the preparation, despite all the knowledge and skill, winter could still bring devastation. Starvation and winter death were real threats that hung over every community. Some winters were simply harsher than anticipated. Unusual snow depths could prevent hunting and trap people in camps. Sudden temperature drops could freeze fingers and toes. Frostbite was a constant danger in the far north. Diseases like scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, could affect communities with limited access to fresh foods over long winters. Hunting could fail. A particularly harsh winter might mean that the game animals didn't appear as expected, or appeared in much smaller numbers than usual. A people that had planned on supplementing their stored food with winter hunting might find that hunting was impossible. In such a situation, the stored food had to stretch further, and rationing became more severe. Fires in winter camps could destroy stored food. A cooking fire that spread could burn through bark and hide structures that contain preserved meats and foods. The loss could be catastrophic, turning a winter camp with adequate supplies into a community facing starvation. Predation was also a real threat. A cache of meat stored above ground could be raided by wolves or bears, despite efforts to keep it secure. Large predators could even enter winter camps and threaten human lives. Some historical accounts describe winters where predators were particularly active, drawn by human settlements with abundant food. Disease could strike suddenly. While most native peoples were largely free from many of the epidemics that would devastate them after European contact, respiratory illnesses could spread in crowded winter camps. The combination of crowding, cold, and limited access to certain nutrients could make people vulnerable to illness. Some communities experienced actual starvation. Historical records describe winters where stored food was depleted before spring arrived. In such cases, people would search desperately for any food source, boiling bones for soup, eating bark from trees, hunting animals that were normally taboo or considered unfit to eat. Survival in these extreme situations sometimes meant hard choices. In some traditions, there are stories of communities that had to decide who would receive food and who would not in cases of extreme scarcity. Some of these stories describe elderly people choosing to eat less so that children could eat more. Others describe individuals who volunteered to leave the group to reduce the burden on the community stores. These aren't comfortable stories, but they're part of the historical reality. Winter could be merciless, and human communities had to make impossible choices to ensure that at least some members survived to see spring. The psychological toll of winter should not be underestimated. Months of cold, months of darkness in northern regions, limited ability to move around outdoors, the constant worry about whether stored food would last. All of this created stress and strain. Some accounts mention depression and irritability becoming common in winter camps. Violence sometimes erupted over trivial matters. Communities that had lived together peacefully for months could develop serious conflicts as winter wore on. The arrival of spring was not just a practical relief. It was an emotional and psychological relief. Fresh foods began to appear, the days grew longer, the temperature rose, people could move outside more freely. The season of scarcity was ending, and the season of abundance was beginning. The relief and joy at this transition was often expressed through ceremonies and celebrations. Though we have been speaking of these practices largely in the past tense, it is important to understand that many Native American communities continue to practice traditional food preservation and acquisition today. While much has changed, much has also remained. Many indigenous communities continue to hunt and fish according to traditional seasons and methods. The Inuit of the Arctic continue to hunt seals in ways that are fundamentally similar to those used for generations. Pacific Northwest tribes continue to fish for salmon and to smoke and preserve them, often using traditional methods or modified versions of traditional methods. Great Plains tribes continue to hunt buffalo, where herds have been restored. The knowledge of traditional foods and their preparation has been preserved in some communities and is being revived in others. Elders who remember traditional practices are teaching younger generations. Written records and historical accounts are being used to revive practices that were disrupted by colonization and forced assimilation. Community-supported agriculture programs that connect indigenous farmers to consumers are using traditional agricultural practices. These programs often emphasize the cultivation of traditional crop varieties and the preparation of traditional foods. The Three Sisters agriculture of the Northeast and Southwest, growing corn, beans, and squash together, continues to be practiced. Seed saving from traditional varieties ensures that these plants remain available and adapted to their local environments. Smoked salmon remains a valued food in Pacific Northwest communities, though modern smoking facilities have supplemented or replaced traditional smokehouses. But the basic process and the traditional knowledge about timing and techniques remain. Pemmican and other preserved meat preparations continue to be made, sometimes for personal consumption and sometimes for sale. The techniques used are often very similar to traditional methods, though They may incorporate modern tools like grinders. Some communities have established food sovereignty initiatives, working to restore and maintain the ability to feed themselves from traditional food sources. These initiatives often involve land restoration projects to improve hunting and fishing, seed preservation and cultivation programs, and education about traditional foods and food preparation. The documentation and preservation of knowledge has also become important. Written cookbooks and how-to guides record traditional recipes and preparation methods. Videos capture elders demonstrating traditional techniques. This documentation serves to preserve knowledge for future generations and also to share knowledge among communities that may have faced disruption. The nutritional understanding of traditional diets has also been validated by modern science. Research has shown that the balanced diets that resulted from hunting, fishing, and gathering, and the seasonal eating patterns provided better nutritional profiles than many modern diets. The seasonal variation that was a necessity for historical peoples is now recognized as beneficial for health and sustainability. The principles that govern traditional winter food strategies, planning ahead, storing abundance for times of scarcity, respecting resources, working collectively, remain relevant even in modern times. In an age of environmental uncertainty and concerns about food systems, these principles offer wisdom. As we reach the end of our journey together, let us pause and reflect on what we have learned about how Native Americans found and preserved food during winter. We began by standing at the edge of a frozen plain, experiencing the cold and silence of winter. And we traveled through centuries and across a continent, learning about the sophisticated systems that allowed entire nations of people not just to survive winter, but to thrive. Think about the enormous span of knowledge that had to be accumulated and preserved, the understanding of which plants were edible and how to process them, the knowledge of animal behavior and migration patterns, the chemistry of preservation, how smoking works, how drying prevents spoilage, how salt and fat interact with meat to preserve it, the physics of storage, the temperature and humidity conditions necessary for different foods, the designs of structures that would protect food from predators and weather, the engineering of tools, snowshoes that distributed weight, traps that worked without a hunter present, fishing techniques that could provide food through solid ice. And yet, all of this knowledge was not written in textbooks. It existed in the minds and hands of community members, transmitted orally and through practice. It existed in stories and in ceremonies. It existed in the bodies of people who had learned to move with snowshoes as naturally as we walk without them, who could identify a plant by touching a leaf, who could read animal tracks and predict where animals would be. What strikes many observers about these systems is their resilience. They weren't fragile. They didn't depend on a single technique or a single food source. They depended on diversity, multiple food sources, multiple preservation methods, multiple backup systems. A failure in one area could be compensated for by success in another. There's also something to note about the relationship between humans and their environment. These weren't systems of conquest or domination. They were systems of partnership. The people knew their land. They understood its rhythms and its seasons. They worked with the environment rather than against it. They took what they needed and no more. They managed their territories to ensure continued abundance. The result was sustainability that lasted for thousands of years. There's wisdom here for modern people. We live in an age of apparent abundance where food is available year-round from distant sources. We don't think in terms of seasons. We don't plan for scarcity. We often waste food. We have largely lost the skills and knowledge of preservation and storage that our ancestors possessed. Yet, climate change, supply chain disruptions, and other modern challenges are making some people reconsider these old ways. Community gardens and small-scale agriculture are growing in popularity. Farmers markets and local food systems are expanding. Some people are learning to preserve food, canning, drying, fermenting. These modern food preservation practices are, in many ways, versions of the ancient techniques. The principles of planning ahead, of working with seasons, of respecting resources, of community cooperation. These remain relevant and important, whether we're living in the 21st century or the 21st century before our common era. As you lie in the darkness listening to these words, allow yourself to imagine what it might have been like. Imagine yourself in a winter camp, the cold just beyond the shelter of your structure. The fire is burning steadily, providing warmth and light. Around you are the sounds of community, voices talking, children playing, the work of preservation happening. In storage nearby are dried meats and smoked fish, berries and nuts, all carefully gathered and prepared. You know that your community has planned well. The food will last until spring. There will be hardships, certainly. There will be moments of cold and hunger, but you will endure. Imagine the knowledge that lives in your hands and in your mind. You know which plants are safe to eat. You know how to track an animal in the snow. You know how to preserve meat so it will last through the winter. You know the stories of your people, the history of your lineage, the ceremonies and traditions that bind your community together. You are not just an individual struggling to survive. You are part of something larger, a people, a culture, a way of being in the world that stretches back through generations. And imagine the spring, the ice beginning to break on the rivers, the first birds returning from the south, the first tender plants emerging from the warming earth. The sense of relief and joy as the harsh season ends and the season of plenty begins. You have survived, your community has survived, and you begin the preparation once again for the next winter, the next cycle, the next season of scarcity and abundance. This is the story we have been telling. It's a story of human ingenuity and resilience. It's a story of sophisticated knowledge systems. It's a story of community and cooperation. It's a story that spans centuries and continents, that shows how human beings adapted to extraordinary challenges and not just survived, but created rich, meaningful lives. As you listen to these final words, I invite you to allow your body and mind to rest. The journey we have taken together through Native American winter food systems, through preservation techniques and hunting strategies, through the seasonal cycles of preparation and scarcity. This journey is complete. You have learned about food security systems that sustained entire nations through harsh winters. You have traveled through forests and plains, through Arctic wastes and coastal regions. You have sat in winter camps and learned the wisdom of the elders. Now it is time to rest. Let your breathing become deeper and more relaxed. Feel your body becoming heavier, sinking into the comfort of your bed or chair. The cold of the winter plains we have explored is far away. You are warm and safe. The fires of winter camps continue to burn in your imagination, providing comfort and security as you drift towards sleep. The knowledge we have explored together, the practical knowledge of food preservation, and the deeper wisdom about planning, community, and resilience. This knowledge remains with you. It rests now in your unconscious mind, becoming part of how you understand the world and human possibility. As you move towards sleep, remember that those who came before us possessed wisdom that we are only now beginning to fully appreciate. They lived in tune with the seasons. They planned for scarcity and worked together for the common good. They used their knowledge and their tools to create systems that sustain their people through the harshest conditions imaginable. And in doing so, they created cultures of remarkable richness and depth. Sleep now, carrying with you the warmth of community, the knowledge of seasons, and the understanding that human beings can create sustainable systems that allow not just survival, but flourishing. If you've enjoyed this journey through Native American winter food strategies, please consider liking and subscribing to Whispers of Time. Your support helps us continue to bring you these immersive historical narratives designed to help you relax and learn. Thank you for traveling with us tonight through the seasons and the centuries. May you rest well, and may you carry these stories and this wisdom with you.